Hey guys, Action Jackson here. Today I wanted to talk to you about a couple of different topics. I've noticed on the Reddit a number of people reacting poorly to the constructed tournament which happened. It was hosted by Artifact Shark last weekend, and it says 34, but I could have sworn it was 35 players showed up to play. So anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about the metagame and this tournament as it pertains to that, because I think it was predominantly red-green. Definitely some interesting stuff worth talking about with regards to that. Is actually, looking at the data, it's predominantly red-blue, but red-green performed the best. So anyway, we're going to go through this a little bit, and I'm going to talk about why it's not as representative of like a solved meta as maybe it appears. But I want to chat about a few other things too. So two cards were revealed recently that are particularly interesting to chat about. That is Cheating Death and Clausereme Hourglass, I think is how you pronounce it. So I want to go over that stuff a little bit, and then also I just wanted to let you guys know that I created a deck tech on this site called artcraft.io. I'll put a link to it in the description. Check it out, let me know what you think. Let me know if you enjoyed this kind of content. I had a blast writing it. This deck's very fun. I don't think that it is one I would have ran in the tournament this weekend had I played in it, which I did not, just because I kind of knew that red-green was going to be, you know, a big player, kind of the enemy deck. And I'll get into what that means a little later. You're going to have a tougher time against that than something like a blue-red deck or a blue-green deck or something like that. Let's first chat about this tournament that Artifact Shark ran. There's some stats here that are pretty interesting. All right, let's start here. So a couple of interesting things worth talking about. First things first, you can see obviously red, blue, and green, blue, very, very popular. And in terms of heroes that were selected, if you look through some of these lists, for example, there was a lot of commonality. Like Drow Ranger was extremely prevalent. Axe and Legion Commander were extremely prevalent. And what I want to talk about is how that doesn't necessarily speak to some kind of brokenness in the metagame where these heroes are intrinsically better than others. It also doesn't speak to these archetypes being intrinsically better than others. And to best illustrate this point, I want to talk about a different game which has more linear strategies. So if any of you guys are familiar with Magic the Gathering, a lot of the decks in the modern format are extremely linear. So for example, all right, so if we look at this deck, for example, this is a fairly broken deck when it gets to do what it likes. For those of you who don't know what Magic is, or maybe don't know what Modern is like and don't know this archetype, basically Dredge is an archetype where you can draw cards from your graveyard that you've placed in there that have the keyword Dredge, instead of drawing your normal cards. And so basically, the strategy is extremely linear. You discard as many things as you possibly can through effects like Cathartic Reunion and Faithless Looting. And then instead of drawing cards, you dredge ones that are most useful to you. And you have a bunch of things that, you know, do stuff when they go into the graveyard, or, you know, can come back from your graveyard in other ways. So anyway, this deck list is extremely strong in a vacuum, but in a healthy metagame, it's kept in balance by the fact that typically there are lots of ways of dealing with it, right? In the sideboard, often players will tech in a lot of graveyard hate cards that just remove all the cards from the opponent's graveyard, and it becomes very difficult for this deck to do well if graveyard hate either makes its way into the main board in response to this becoming popular, or if graveyard hate is particularly common in the sideboard because there's maybe a less intense graveyard deck that is popular at the time. And so as it pertains to Artifact and the point that I want to make, when you see this top 8, which has, let's see, there's red-green, 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 right? Pretty popular. And you see that there's loads of Axe and Legion Commander and Drow Ranger. What you have to realize is that the reason why those heroes and those deck archetypes work so well is because people aren't necessarily teching against those deck archetypes. Historically, I mean, red-green ramp midrange was like one of the first and, you know, most popular archetypes at the beginning of the beta, like 7 months ago. It basically had a super poor performance from maybe the second or third tournament, I'm not sure how many were ran before I got in, up through now. The reason for that is largely because the meta shifted in such a way that red-green was hard to play, right? There's plenty of methods by which you can punish red-green ramp, and you can punish heroes like Drow, Axe, and Legion. These heroes are all very good at playing a mid-range game, and if people get too greedy towards control, or if people play mid-range decks like green-blue that can't deal with Axe very well, then obviously that deck archetype is going to do well. But if the meta shifts maybe towards more black-blue, because there was, I don't know if it's public information how many people played that list, but there was very few that played that list in this tournament, or if it shifts towards black-red economy, then the red-green deck really loses a lot of its edge for a couple of reasons. Like, if you imagine black-red econ, it can typically interfere with the plan of red-green. Like, maybe it's so threatening on board that instead of using your Celemania's Favor or your Stars Alliance, because you know you're just going to get dueled and die, you have to gust if you don't want to die, and that means you have to wait another turn to go off. And so black-red in that situation can actually force the game to naturally progress to a later stage, rather than what red-green ramp wants to do, which is to cheat their way into a late-game scenario early. Additionally, outside of just archetype responses to a metagame that features red-green, there's also hero techs that you could do, or card techs. For example, maybe running Abaddon is reasonable in a metagame filled with Time of Triumph, because you have purge effects. And additionally, it's a very robust hero that doesn't die to things like the Axe and the Legion Commander very easily. So there's ways that you can tech against it, and there's also ways to sort of strategize against it. And both of these cause the meta to be very cyclical, right? I believe the first deck that won a tournament in the beta, at least, from chatting to a few people who maybe remember better than me, was a red-black money deck, and then it was followed by a blue-green swarm deck, then a blue-red control list, and then a red-black control list. So, the meta went through all these evolutions, and it ended up on red-black control, and then there was a couple of unofficial tournaments, and I think blue-black control did pretty good at one point. Blue-green storm, I think, won an unofficial tournament. After that, there was nothing but draft tournaments for like 4 or 5 months, and very few people were really putting their time and energy into Constructed. But I think, as you can see from this tournament, the people who correctly read the metagame and said, all right, there's going to be a decent amount of green-blue and red-blue. Red-green does quite well against both of these archetypes, depending on how you tech the deck. They correctly understood that if I run red-green, I'm going to be favored against the field. Essentially, the point I'm trying to make is, I noticed at least a few comments on Reddit saying, Axe and Legion are in every deck, Drow's in every deck. Sure, that's because they came prepared to the tournament, understanding the metagame and understanding how to interrupt what everyone else is trying to do. There was actually some really interesting other decks that I think are worth noting, like Vin Kelsier's red-green gold deck. Super cool. Like, I think this was a very smart metagame call. So, also, this red-black siege deck is kind of interesting to me. I'm not sure why it's called red-black siege, because there isn't particularly much siege in here, but regardless. Also notice that even this relatively aggressive list is running Vesture of the Tyrant. Like, that's clearly a response to the fact that I imagine most people expected green-blue to be the predominant deck in this tournament. In a 1,024 player tournament, like you might get at some Grand Prix or something, you certainly wouldn't have seen any deck edge out with such a strong lead, right? But in addition to that, it's the metagame is, as I said, super cyclical, and the people who read correctly the atmosphere were able to deal best in the tournament. It's also worth noting that the winning deck was actually Emtee's blue-green combo deck, right? So Celemania's Storm, which is a little bit surprising to me, because I feel like the matchup against red-green ramp is not necessarily great, but it managed to pan out. I think it's less of a tremendous difference in how those decks are able to perform against each other than some matchups. You also need to look at the reason why certain heroes are picked, right? Like, this deck this archetype simply doesn't function the same without Drow. It's not that Drow is unilaterally broken, necessarily. It's that in this specific deck, in a combo deck, you have to have Gust so that when you combo with your Stars Align, you don't just get interrupted. Versus like a blue-green mid-range deck, which might not necessarily run Drow, probably does. But combo, by necessity, has to run Drow. Also worth noting that if the metagame had been substantially control-y, would have been reasonable perhaps for something like a Pugna to find its way into some of these red-green decks. For example, Bristleback is a pretty interesting hero to be in Van Kelsier's list. I'm a little surprised by that one. I think that signals to me that he was expecting maybe more like red-black or maybe even red-green, right? Something that is going to have a lot of robust heroes that he wants to be able to stick on the board against and also hopefully kill. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure I understand where the frustration is coming with regards to the constructed metagame. Hopefully, again, I've made my point in order to illustrate why it's nothing to be concerned about. Alright, so now I want to talk about a couple of cards that were revealed during the last weekend, I guess a couple of days ago now, that I think are just interesting to talk about. And hopefully you'll find some useful insight with what I can talk about with regards to them. I'm going to start with Cheating Death because it's definitely the more controversial, and I understand the concern, right? Because for a long time, I was in the camp of feeling like Cheating Death was like a poorly designed card. The frustration that you feel when you don't understand Cheating Death is totally fair, but I think it's worth considering the valuable function that it has in the game. Firstly, this card keeps Annihilation in check, and I've talked before on the channel about how Annihilation is a very meta-warping card. It is a very meta-warping card. Cheating Death really allows for like green-blue to even be a deck. It would be extremely difficult to build one without it unless it is Selemene Storm, and I think it would be pretty unfortunate and unhealthy if the only green-blue deck was a combo deck that had a pretty linear strategy. Also, certain types of mid-range decks kind of rely on this card too. I'd say green-black mid-range relies on it, as well as, a true green-red mid-range versus a ramp deck. That's the first thing to consider. Also, keep in mind, as it has been revealed, there's no green initiative card, so you don't have a way of, like, in even mono green, let's say, interfering with your opponent's ability to interfere with you. So Cheating Death is very important to green's ability to actually do stuff in a lot of different archetypes. Secondly, it uniquely prevents against something that I'm not sure how else I only have one really good idea for how else you could deal with this, but if you consider the cross lane effects of people like Sniper or Pickoff, you don't really have an avenue to interact with those because they're on another board. If someone's deployed a black hero in a lane and you have nothing there and you can't silence it or you can't kill it, Assassination just poops on your day, right? Like, it makes it really, really difficult for a green deck to deal with that. And so, or any deck, as a matter of fact. And that's actually one of the unique strengths of green, is that it's uniquely good against cross-lane stuff. It wouldn't be impossible for some kind of cross-lane metagame to develop in the absence of Cheat Death. And this pretty, it doesn't shut it down. As I said earlier, the metagame is cyclical. Maybe that deck does have a place. But this will always keep it in check in the same way that it keeps Annihilation in check. Another thing to note is that whilst 50% chance of surviving with 1 health is very coin flippy, it's literally a coin flip, Cheating Death can only affect a given lane at a time, like per copy of the card. And so, in the same way that maybe you would avoid like a lane that has 2 conflagrations and an ignite or whatever, you might just play around Cheating Death, and it's only 1/3 of the map. You can maneuver around it. There's plenty of improvement removal in the game, and I think it's critical to have some access to some in basically every single list. The single weakest point of black-blue control is that there's not really a good place to put improvement removal. Like, you either need to run Obliterating Orbs or Demagicking Balls, And in Black-Blue Control, those things aren't necessarily items that you want in your deck, because you want to be reliably seeing Vesture of the Tyrant and that kind of thing. Honestly, the best answer in Black-Blue Control to cheating death is Apotheosis Blade. And I've started to value that card more highly because improvements have become better, and it also deals with gold generation strategies sometimes. So anyway, it's certainly an answerable card. Maybe the turn it comes down, it's not answerable unless you've appropriately set up with the presence of mind to deal with it ahead of time. But it's not impossible to deal with. What I will say is that I think cheating death is very frustrating, and my personal philosophy on design is to avoid frustrating cards at all costs. As an analogy, if you were to ask me whether I'd prefer a character to have a speed up for themselves or a slow down for an opponent, I'd almost always rather have, there's certain cases because it's not entirely analogous, but I'd almost always rather have the speed up, right? Because the speed up provides more agency for at least one of the two players and doesn't provide less for the other. But a slowdown provides less agency for one player and more for the other. And cheat death provides much less agency for the player who is not on that side of the board. It's not the best analogy because I can't think of an equivalent like speed up versus slowdown thing for the card, but I'm just trying to explain the way I feel about design. I do think that this card would still be very reasonable if it read something along the lines of, after a green card is cast in any lane this round, give, and then the rest of the text. So basically, you could play this in the right lane if you wanted to, but if you didn't play a green spell in the left lane, you wouldn't have access to the cheat death effect to dodge any cross lane stuff. I guess if there was any change that I wanted to see to the card, that would be it. But honestly, more and more, I'm finding it pretty reasonable to deal with, and I think it's a healthy card for the game, as frustrating as it can be. Speaking of frustrating, but maybe healthy, I'm less sure about this one, Clausream Hourglass. So Clausream Hourglass is a card that very quickly people will realize is really, really strong. It doesn't necessarily pop when you are first evaluating cards as the most ridiculous thing, but believe me, this card can single-handedly carry you through games. I do think that it is healthy also, mostly because it is the best avenue for red-black econ mid-rangey decks to deal with heavy control blue-black decks, and it's also really good in very low-to-the-ground decks that need to stop control from just running over them in the late game if they fall behind. It essentially buys you a turn, which is pretty critical against a lot of the big things that come out from control later. But definitely keep your eyes peeled for this card. I would highly suggest picking up 3 of these, and unless you're net decking, if you're trying to be creative with your own decks, this is the one card I'd be don't be creative, just put it in and see if it works or not, because typically it will, and it's very, very strong. It's also really fun to put this card into blue-black control. Sometimes you want to and one for me this card rather than paydaying a turn later and getting bigger items like Vesture and Horn or Apotheosis Blade, because you just need to buy time. Very thematic. So definitely these two cards, both quite frustrating at times to deal with, but the frustration will fade, I promise. I just know that there's a thread about cheating death, for example, being frustrating RNG, and definitely it can be, but it's also pretty healthy for the game. It fills a much needed role. So try to go easy on Valve for this one. Plus it makes for some pretty spectacular moments, at least for one player, and that's better than fewer spectacular moments for either. Alright, so that's all for this video. It was kind of a quicker one. I do plan on doing a little bit more analysis now that the beta has been delayed, which, by the way, I'm sad that it's delayed, but I think it was probably the right decision by Valve, just to make the game as good as it possibly can be upon release. Totally respect that, and not burning them out with crunch time is also something to respect. But in any case, I think I'm going to make at least one more analysis video. A couple of people have sent me decks that they want me to check out, and I'll probably put one of those videos out soon also. For the time being, I hope you've enjoyed this one. I am starting up the project I mentioned a little while ago with a podcast soon. Not sure when it's going to air, but I'll try and time my next video around such that I can announce it ahead of time. I think I'm also going to be, I'm just remembering this, I'm going to be on a podcast called Deck Imp Radio sometime soon, talking about decks in the game that are not meant to be rather than ones that are. So hopefully that's fun. Check those guys out, and if possible, I'll let you know when that's coming out too. All right, thanks guys. I'll catch you next time.